Section 1. The Illusion of Fearlessness. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine something that cannot die, not something that is hard to kill, not something that heals quickly, or something that fights through pain without flinching. Imagine something that truly, genuinely, fundamentally cannot die. It does not age, it does not bleed, it does not tire, it does not hunger, it does not dream, and it does not weep. Its skeleton is forged from a living metal that repairs itself at the molecular level. Its body generates no warmth, draws no breath, and leaves no footprint in the invisible ocean of psychic energy that permeates the universe. When it is destroyed, it reassembles. When it is scattered to atoms, a dimensional tomb somewhere beneath a forgotten world draws those atoms back, reconstructs the machine from nothing, and reactivates it to fight again. Now imagine an entire civilization built from those things. 60 million years ago, the Necrons went to sleep. They buried themselves in vast tomb complexes beneath the surfaces of dead worlds scattered across the galaxy, sealed their gates, silenced their systems, and slipped into a hibernation so deep it resembled extinction. The galaxy continued without them. Civilizations rose. Stars were born and collapsed. Species evolved, achieved sapience, built empires, warred against one another, and crumbled to dust. The Eldar came and went through the heights of their golden age. Humanity stumbled out of its cradle on a small blue world and began the long, painful process of conquering the stars. 10,000 years of the Imperium ground by, full of fire and death and faith. And through all of it, the Necrons simply slept, silent in the dark beneath the surface of worlds no one thought to look at twice. Then they woke up. The galaxy into which the Necrons have reawakened is, by any measure, a terrible place. It is a universe at war with itself, riddled with Xenos empires, suffused with psychic corruption, stalked by things from beyond reality, and crowned by a fractured human civilization so vast and so desperate that it would rather burn entire star systems than risk losing them to the enemy. It is a galaxy that should, by any reasonable assessment, be afraid of the Necrons. And it is. The Imperium of Man trembles at the mention of Tomb World activations. Eldar seers see visions of metal tides sweeping across habitable worlds and go pale with something they would never call fear. But that looks remarkably like it from the outside. The Orcs, who have never truly feared anything in the history of their species, give Necron forces a certain wide-berth respect that speaks volumes. Even the Tau, ever optimistic, ever analytical, ever convinced that diplomacy or superior firepower can solve any problem, have encountered Necron fleets and come away from those encounters with a new and sobering humility. The Necrons are undying. They are ancient beyond comprehension. They fought the old ones at the height of the galaxy's first great civilization, and they won. They defeated beings of such cosmic power that the Eldar still whisper their names with reverence. They shattered gods. They consumed stars. They rewrote the laws of physics to serve as weapons. There is almost nothing in the known universe that the Necrons have not, at some point in their long and terrible history, faced and overcome. And yet, if you look closely enough, and this requires looking very, very closely, because the Necrons are not in the habit of displaying weakness, you begin to find things. Cracks in the adamantine facade, hesitations in the cold logic of dynasty politics, decisions that cannot be fully explained by tactical calculation or the accumulated strategic wisdom of 60 million years. You begin to find, buried beneath the indifference and the silence and the unstoppable advance of metal legions, something that feels unmistakably like fear. This is what we are going to explore today, not the fear that others feel in the presence of the Necrons. That fear is well documented and entirely warranted. We are going to explore something far stranger and far more interesting, the fears that exist within the Necrons themselves, the things that unsettle the undying, the shadows that move at the edges of consciousness for beings who were never supposed to have consciousness in the first place, the nightmares of creatures who cannot dream. Because here is the truth that makes the Necrons so fascinating, so tragically compelling. They are not, in any honest sense, fearless. They are afraid. Many of them are afraid in ways that run so deep, so fundamental, so ancient, that the fear itself has become part of who they are. And understanding what they fear and why tells you more about the Necrons than any description of their weapons, their tactics, their military strength, or their political structures ever could. Fear reveals the soul, and the Necrons, those cold metal, supposedly soulless machines, have more soul than they would ever want you to know. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with a name, the Necron Tyre. Before they were Necrons, before they were undying, before the metal and the void and the endless silence, there was a species of mortal beings who lived and breathed and suffered beneath a sun that hated them. The Necrontyr homeworld orbited a volatile, radiation-heavy star. The particles that world bathed in daily were carcinogenic at levels that made long life essentially impossible. The Necrontyr lived, on average, perhaps 40 years. Some barely reached 20. Their entire civilization was built in the shadow of constant death, constant loss, constant awareness that every breath might be among the last you were allocated. They were, in many ways, defined by that awareness. A culture so intimate with mortality that death became not a fear, but a constant companion, a lens through which everything was viewed. They built ossuaries of extraordinary beauty. They developed philosophies of impermanence so sophisticated that modern Eldar philosophers occasionally quote Necrons or thinkers without knowing who wrote the words. They created a calendar based not on years, but on the number of generations a building had survived, because buildings lasted longer than people, and they looked up at the stars and burned with envy. Because somewhere out there, they could tell, were species that did not die so easily, species that were not poisoned by their own sun, species that lived for centuries, perhaps longer, perhaps forever. The universe was vast and old, and full of things that endured, and the Necrontyr were small and brief, and consumed by the awareness of their own brevity. That awareness curdled, over time, into something darker. It became resentment. It became rage. It became, eventually, war. The Necrontyr expanded into the stars and warred against the Old Ones, that ancient, incomprehensible species of beings who had seeded the galaxy with life, and who lived for spans of time so enormous they barely registered the Necrontyr at all. The wars went badly. The Old Ones were too powerful, too wise, too patient. The Necrontyr were defeated, retreated, licked their wounds, and seethed, and then they made the deal that ended them. The Citan, the star gods, the entities of living stellar energy who fed on the radiation of suns, came to the Necrontyr in their hour of defeat and offered them exactly what they had always wanted: immortality, eternal life, freedom from the sun that had poisoned them for their entire history as a species. The price was everything, although the Necrontyr did not fully understand the terms until it was far too late. Biotransference, the process was called, and we will return to it in depth, but the short version is this. The Necrontyr gave up their flesh, their emotions, their psychic presence, their souls, and in exchange they received bodies of living metal, necrodermis, and theoretically eternal life. They became the Necrons, and what they became was, in almost every meaningful sense, no longer the Necrontyr at all. The Necrons that exist today carry the memory of the Necrontyr. They know what they were. The greatest of them, the pharaons, the overlords, the legendary Silent King himself, remember the mortal life they sacrificed with a clarity that makes the memory feel like a wound. And in that memory, in that awareness of what was taken, lies the deepest and most fundamental fear that the Necrons carry. Not the fear of death, but the fear of what they have already lost, and the terror that it can never be recovered. That is the foundation. That is the bedrock of everything we are going to discuss. But before we go deeper, let us pause here, at the threshold of this story, and acknowledge something wonderful. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever hour the clock says on your wall, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. Are you watching this at midnight with headphones on, letting the lore wash over you? Are you on a lunch break, stealing 20 minutes of peace from a busy day? Are you somewhere in the world where this kind of deep dive into fictional history is a small, private pleasure? Tell me. I genuinely want to know, because there is something remarkable about the fact that a story 60 million years old, set in a universe that does not exist, reaches people everywhere, in every time zone, in every corner of this real and actual world. That connection is worth noting. And if this kind of storytelling is something you find yourself returning to, consider subscribing. There is so much more to explore, and I would love to have you along for the journey. Now, let us go deeper into the dark. Section 2. The Ghost of What They Were, the Horror of Biotransference. There is a particular quality to grief that comes not from loss through accident or violence, but from loss through choice. When something is taken from you without warning, there is a cleanness to the tragedy. You were whole, and then you were not. And there is a before and an after with a clear line between them. But when you chose the loss, when you walked toward it with open eyes, believing you understood the price only to discover too late that you understood almost nothing, that grief has a different texture. It is not clean. It is not simple. It is tangled up in self-recrimination and the suffocating awareness that the hand that took everything from you was, in the most fundamental sense, your own. This is the grief the Necrons carry. This is the horror at the center of their civilization, the wound that never heals in a species that cannot die, the shadow that falls across every dynasty court, every flickering moment of restored personality in a pharaoh or overlord who has managed to retain enough of themselves to remember who they were. Let us talk about biotransference. Let us really talk about it in detail, because the details matter enormously. The Necrontyr were dying, not just individually, the way all mortal things die, but as a civilization. The wars against the Old Ones had gone catastrophically. The Necrontyr had thrown everything they had at a species so ancient and so powerful that the Old Ones had barely noticed the assault. Defeat had been total and humiliating, and the Necrontyr, returning to their irradiated homeworld with their military shattered and their cultural confidence in ruins, were in the grip of a collective despair that some historians of their civilization describe as a kind of species-wide death wish. They had tried to prove themselves worthy of the stars, had been shown with devastating clarity that they were not, and now they faced the prospect of slow extinction on a world that had always been slowly killing them. The Citan found them in that moment. The star gods, and let us be careful here about what the Citan actually are, because this is important, were not gods in any theological sense, though they were godlike in their power. They were entities of pure energy, beings of stellar plasma and radiation who had existed since very shortly after the birth of the universe itself. They predated almost everything. They fed on the energy of stars, drifting between suns in the deep void, ancient beyond any useful measurement, alien in their consciousness to a degree that makes even the Eldar's psychology seem accessible by comparison. The Citan had names, or at least the Necrons gave them names, and those names tell you something about how they were perceived. The Deceiver, the Nightbringer, the Void Dragon, the Outsider. These were not warm names. These were not names that suggested benevolent cosmic guardians. These were names that carried, even in translation, a quality of cold inevitability. And the Necrontyr, desperate and broken, went to these entities and asked for their help. The Deceiver, called Mephitron by the Necrons, a being of manipulation and cunning so extreme that it makes the most accomplished mortal politicians look like children pretending at chess, had already identified the Necrontyr as useful. The star gods needed vessels. They needed servants. They needed physical agents capable of acting in the material universe with precision and intelligence and strength, because pure energy cannot grip a sword, cannot navigate a starship, cannot build a complex, and cannot strategically direct a military campaign with the kind of nuanced intelligence that wins wars. The Citan were powerful beyond words, but they were limited by their own nature in ways they found frustrating. The Necrontyr, mortal and brilliant and burning with hatred for the universe that had humiliated them, were a perfect solution to this problem. So, the Deceiver presented the offer with perfect precision: eternal life, immortality, the end of the poisonous sun that had cut Necrontyr lifespans to decades, the power to return to the stars and this time, win. The price was described as transformation, the replacement of weak flesh with enduring metal, the liberation of consciousness from the limitations of biology. What the Deceiver did not describe, not in any language the Necrontyr could hear in their desperate state, was what would actually be lost. The process of biotransference required that Necrontyr bodies be completely replaced, not modified, not augmented, replaced. The flesh was unmade, and in its place was grown a body of necrodermis, living metal capable of self-repair, extraordinarily durable, powered not by food and water and sleep, but by the ambient energies of the universe. The consciousness of the Necron tier individual was extracted and encoded into the new metal body. Each memory, each personality trait, each fragment of accumulated experience translated into data patterns running through crystalline matrices. And in that translation, something fundamental was lost. The Necron tier had psychic presences, small flickering souls, nothing like the blazing beacons the Eldar carried, or the more modest but real psychic signatures of humanity, but genuine and real nonetheless. Every mortal being with sufficient consciousness casts a shadow in the warp, the invisible dimension of psychic energy that underlies the material universe. That shadow is, in the deepest philosophical sense, the self. It is the immaterial echo of personality, of memory, of emotion, of the ineffable quality that distinguishes a person from a very sophisticated machine. The necrodermis bodies had no connection to the warp, none. They were, from a psychic perspective, entirely inert, holes in the universe's psychic fabric, walking absences where a presence should have been. The souls of the Necron tier, wrenched free from flesh and unable to anchor themselves in metal, drifted for a moment in the void between material and immaterial, and then scattered, dissipated, were consumed by the chitin, who fed on them like sharks feeding on the blood of wounded prey. The Necrons that stood up from the biotransference forges were not the Necron tier. Not really. They looked like them, in the way that a perfect sculpture of a person looks like them. They had the memories, they had the learned behaviors, they had the personality patterns encoded in their crystal matrices. But the animating spark, the fundamental quality that made those memories belong to a living person rather than a very detailed archive, was gone, consumed, eaten. The greatest Necrons, those of sufficient complexity and seniority that their personality matrices retain genuine depth, eventually come to understand this. Some of them understood it immediately, in the first terrible moments of transformation, looking down at metal hands that felt nothing, and realizing with perfect clarity what had been taken. The Silent King, Sarek, ruler of all Necron tier, the being who authorized biotransference for his entire species, reportedly understood within moments of his own transformation what the deceiver had actually done. And that is, perhaps, the most devastating detail of all. Sarek is not a character who was tricked into something he didn't have the intelligence to see coming. Sarek is, by any measure, one of the most brilliant political and military minds in the history of the galaxy. He led a species that managed to challenge the old ones, beings of such cosmic stature that they created starfaring civilizations as casual experiments. He is not naive. He is not simple. He is not the kind of being who makes enormous decisions without considering consequences. And still he was deceived. Still the price was hidden well enough, was framed cleverly enough, was presented in a context of such desperation that his famous intellect found no purchase, no angle from which the manipulation became visible until it was too late. When Sarek understood, when the full weight of what he had allowed to happen to himself, and to every Necron tier who had trusted his leadership, fell on him with the force of a collapsing world, he turned on the chitin. The war in heaven, that vast, almost incomprehensible conflict that reshaped the early galaxy, eventually turned. The Necrons, using weapons of reality-shattering power, using science so advanced it had moved entirely beyond what most civilizations would even recognize as science, shattered the chitin. They broke those godlike entities into fragments. They imprisoned the shards of what had been star gods in containment vessels called tesseract labyrinths, using the power of beings that had consumed entire worlds to fuel Necron weapons. It was a revenge of extraordinary thoroughness. But it did not undo biotransference. It did not restore the souls that had been consumed. The dead cannot be brought back from the chitin's impossible digestion. The Necron tier are not coming back. And Sarek knows this. He has known it for 60 million years. The Silent King's guilt is not something he displays. He is a ruler, and rulers do not display weakness. And in 60 million years of solitude and silence and wandering, he has learned to carry his guilt with the kind of perfectly controlled stillness that makes it invisible to anyone not looking with extraordinary care. But it is there. It shapes every decision he makes. It is present in his return to the galaxy at the head of a Necron armada to face the Tyranid threat. a decision motivated in part by a sense of obligation so deep it functions as penance. He broke his people. He destroyed them as surely as any enemy could have. The least he can do is fight to preserve what remains. For the rank-and-file Necrons, the warriors and immortals and deathmarks and scarabs who make up the vast majority of Necron forces, the horror of biotransference manifests differently. Most of them have lost so much personality in the long millennia of sleep that they no longer have the cognitive complexity to understand what they lost. They are soldiers in the most complete sense, directed, purposeful, effective, and empty. They do not grieve because they no longer have the architecture for grief. But here is the terrible paradox that haunts the higher orders of Necron society. Recovering self, recovering personality, recovering the cognitive complexity that makes a Necron a genuine individual rather than a very sophisticated automaton. This recovery, which every high-ranking Necron works toward, does not restore what was lost. It does not rebuild the soul. It rebuilds the echo of the soul, the memory of the person, not the person. And the more complete that recovery becomes, the more the recovered Necron understands this distinction, and the more they must live with the knowledge that what they are recovering is not themselves, but rather a detailed portrait of themselves, rendered in perfect fidelity, signifying nothing. There is a Necron philosopher, the cryptech scholar Orican the Diviner, who has spent considerable time and cognitive resource working through exactly this problem, and who has arrived at conclusions so bleak that other Necrons find him difficult company. His central thesis, simplified brutally, is that the question of whether a Necron that recovers its full personality matrix is in any meaningful sense the same being as the Necron tire that was transformed is unanswerable and, more importantly, irrelevant, because the Necron asking the question will never be able to obtain an answer, and will have to live with the uncertainty forever. Forever is a very long time to be uncertain about whether you exist. The horror of biotransference, then, is not simply the horror of transformation or the horror of what was taken. It is the ongoing, perpetual, inescapable horror of waking up every day in a body that cannot feel the sun, cannot taste food, cannot love or grieve in the flesh and blood way that such things demand, and knowing, with perfect mental clarity, exactly what that absence means. The Necrons are afraid of what they have lost, and they are afraid because they cannot stop knowing it. Section 3. The slow erasure, engram degradation, and the fear of losing the self. Here is a question that seems, at first, somewhat philosophical, but which has extremely practical implications for every Necron alive. If you remove your memories one by one, at what point do you stop being you? It is a version of the Ship of Theseus problem, that ancient philosophical puzzle about identity and replacement and continuity. But for the Necrons, it is not a philosophical exercise. It is not a thought experiment conducted in comfortable academic surroundings. It is a lived terror, a daily reality, a process that is happening right now to Necrons across the galaxy, silently, invisibly, with the patient inevitability of erosion on stone. The Necrons encoded their personalities into their necrodermis bodies through a process of translating neural patterns into crystalline data matrices, the engrams. These engrams are not simply stored memories in the way that a computer stores a file. They are dynamic, interconnected, recursive structures that encode not just events and facts, but relationships between events, emotional contexts, personality tendencies, habitual thought patterns, the particular quality that makes one mind different from another, even when both minds have access to the same information. In theory, these engrams should be permanent. Necrodermis is extraordinarily durable, and the crystal matrices that store engram data are among the most precisely engineered structures in the Necron's vast technological repertoire. In practice, nothing lasts forever, not even living metal, not even crystalline matrices designed to endure through the age of stars. The problem became apparent fairly early in Necron history, though its full scope was not understood until much later. Engrams degrade, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but inexorably. The complex web of connections that gives personality its richness begins to simplify. The emotional contexts that give memory meaning begin to fade. The habitual patterns that make a mind recognizably individual begin to blur and generalize. A Necron that was once precise, witty, compassionate, melancholy, curious, all the contradictory, irreducible qualities that human beings describe when they try to capture what makes a person distinctive, becomes, over millennia, less precise, less witty, less anything, becomes more mechanical, more simple, more like the soldiers and warriors that most Necrons eventually are. This process accelerated dramatically during the Great Sleep, the 60-million-year hibernation that the Necrons undertook after the War in Heaven, to wait out the age of the Citan's dominance. During active operation, a Necron's engrams are constantly refreshed by new experience, new information, new interactions that create new connections and reinforce existing ones. Dormant in a tomb complex, all of that refreshment stops. The engrams sit in stasis, but stasis is not perfect preservation. Quantum fluctuations, radiation, the subtle distortions of dimensional instability, the simple accumulation of time on structures that were never quite as permanent as their designers had hoped. All of these work on the dormant matrices like waterworks on limestone, finding the cracks, widening them, wearing away at the details. When the Necrons began to wake from the Great Sleep, the damage was already visible to those who knew what to look for. Warriors who had once been individuals emerged from their tombs as husks, still functional, still capable soldiers, but hollowed out. The rich complexity of their former personalities reduced to simple behavioral routines: fight, protect, obey. Cryptex examining the damage found that in many cases, the degradation was not linear or predictable. Sometimes a Necron would lose its memories of an entire period of life while retaining perfect clarity about other periods. Sometimes the emotional contexts of memories were lost, while the factual content remained, giving the affected Necron access to detailed records of events they could not connect to any felt experience. Sometimes the degradation proceeded in a kind of personality flattening, all the edges worn smooth, all the distinctive qualities sanded away, leaving something that functioned, but in no meaningful sense still resembled the being that had gone to sleep. For the higher-ranking Necrons, those of sufficient quality of engram to still be recognizable as individuals, this is a source of constant, low-level terror that never entirely goes away. Consider what it would mean to watch yourself slowly becoming less yourself, not through dementia or the gradual changes of age, which are softened by the continuity of experience and the support of people who know you, but to watch, with perfect mental clarity, as the records of your own degradation accumulate. To know, with the analytical precision of a mind that was engineered rather than grown, that the self you are protecting is not static, not safe, not secured simply by your continued existence. To understand that the very thing you are fighting to preserve, your personality, your memories, your sense of who you were and who you are, is being consumed by time itself, granule by granule, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Many Necron overlords and pharaons engage in what the cryptex call memory ritual, structured exercises designed to reinforce engrams through active recall and re-encoding. They tell themselves their own histories, cycling through memories deliberately, using the act of remembering to strengthen the connections that passive storage allows to weaken. Some of these rituals have become extraordinarily elaborate over the centuries, entire ceremonies that can take days of subjective time, in which a single Necron revisits every significant event of their remembered life in careful sequence, searching for degradation, patching gaps where they can, acknowledging with something that functions very much like grief, the places where details have already gone beyond recovery. The Silent King Sarek is, by necessity and character, among the most rigorous practitioners of memory ritual known to any Necron. He has been awake longer than almost any other Necron. His great sleep was periodically interrupted, his vigil over the closed tombs more active than most. He has taken meticulous care of his own engram integrity, and his personality matrix is, by the assessments of the cryptex who serve him, remarkably intact for its age. But remarkably intact is not perfect. Not even Zarek can arrest time entirely. He knows things he has forgotten, in the way that one knows there was a shelf where something used to sit, without being able to recall what the object was. He carries the outlines of memories that once had substance and now have only shape. He does not speak of this, but the knowledge that even his famous perfect memory is an edited version of itself, that the silent king who moves through the galaxy pronouncing judgment and strategy does so with a partial record of his own history, is a weight that sits alongside every other weight he carries. There are darker outcomes than gradual erosion. The phenomenon known as going mindless represents the terminal stage of engram degradation, the point at which so much of the personality matrix has been lost that the Necron in question can no longer be said to have a self at all. They still function. They still fight. They still operate their weapons and follow battlefield patterns and perform the mechanical tasks of warfare with perfect technical execution. But there is no one home. The lights are on, the machinery is running, and every seat at the table is empty. For Necrons of high rank, going mindless is the most feared personal catastrophe imaginable. It is worse than destruction. At least destruction has the dignity of an ending, the finality of cessation. Going mindless is to continue, endlessly, in a shell that still looks like you, still moves like you, still occupies the same position in the dynasty you built or inherited, while the thing that made you you is gone as if it never existed. Your titles remain. Your weapons remain. Your palace on some ancient tomb world remains. Every object in it arranged exactly as you left it. But you are not there to sit on your throne or walk your halls. Something is there, something that wears your shape and obeys your old behavioral patterns and fights in your name, but you are gone. The Necron phrase for this condition translates inadequately to the eternal march. Not a glorious connotation, as one might hope, but an almost unbearably melancholy one. The image of a consciousness that has lost its content but cannot stop moving, cannot sit down, cannot rest, cannot end. Marching forever in the dark between the stars, going nowhere, carrying nothing, remembering nothing, but still, relentlessly going. The fear of this fate is not abstract for most high-ranking Necrons. They have seen it happen. They know individuals, colleagues, rivals, mentors, companions from the old world, who have undergone exactly this transformation. Some of them have made the decision, the terrible, dignified decision, to request destruction before degradation progresses to that point. To choose the finality of cessation rather than the horror of continuation without content. This is, in Necron culture, a profound and deeply personal choice, and it is viewed with a complexity of respect and grief that suggests the weight those making the choice carry in the moment they make it. The question of what to do with Necrons who have already gone mindless is handled differently by different dynasties. Some simply continue to deploy them as soldiers. After all, they fight well enough. And tactical resource is tactical resource, regardless of the philosophical status of the unit. Others place them in sealed vaults, endless caverns deep in tomb complexes, where they walk their eternal march away from public sight, out of consideration for the distress their presence causes to Necrons, who are not yet mindless and would prefer not to be reminded of where they might end up. The Nihilak dynasty is particularly haunted by this problem, having awakened from the Great Sleep to find a disproportionate number of their warriors in advanced states of engram degradation. The Pharaon Nemesor Zandres, himself affected by a particularly unusual form of mental disturbance, presides over a court in which the silence is not the comfortable silence of the powerful, but something stranger and sadder. The quiet of a place where many of those present have lost the ability to fill the silence with anything. There is an irony here that is worth noting, because the Necrons are creatures for whom irony has a particular sting. The Necron tier chose biotransference partly because they feared death, feared the brevity of mortal life, feared the sun that killed them young, feared the oblivion they saw waiting at the end of their short years. They transformed themselves into immortal beings specifically to escape the loss that mortality represented. And what they have discovered, in the ages since, is that immortality does not mean the self persists. The self can be erased as thoroughly by time as by death. The slow accumulation of small losses can accomplish what a single fatal blow cannot, can hollow out a being across eons, leaving the shell intact while the content drains away, granule by granule, until there is nothing left inside the undying machine but the echo of a person who is gone. They escaped the death of the body. They did not escape the death of the self, and that perhaps is the cruelest joke the universe has played on the undying. Section 4. The enemy within. The Flayer virus. If engram degradation is the slow erosion of the self, patient, quiet, geological in its time scale, then the Flayer virus is something else entirely. It is not erosion. It is corruption. It is a wound that spreads, that transforms, that takes something of cold perfection and twists it into something that no Necron would choose to become, something that all Necrons regard with a horror that transcends calculation and enters territory they would never call emotional, but which functions exactly like revulsion, exactly like existential dread. Let us talk about the Flayers. Citan shards are fragments of the shattered star gods, pieces of those godlike entities of stellar energy, broken apart by Necron weapons in the aftermath of the war in heaven, and imprisoned in dimensional containment vessels called Tesseract labyrinths. They are not intact beings. They are not the Citan as they were. They are pieces, fragments, and in their fragmentation they have retained various aspects of their former selves in distorted, unbalanced form. Some retain great tactical intelligence. Some retain reality-manipulating power. Some retain only their oldest, most fundamental drives in their most extreme expression. One of the Citan was called Yandu Gor, named the Flayer in the traditions of those who remember. The Flayer was one of the stranger entities among the already very strange Citan. Distinguished by its particular predilection, it consumed flesh. Not energy, not souls, not the psychic residue of consciousness, but physical organic tissue, which was peculiar for an entity of pure stellar energy that had no biological need for nutrition. Yandu Gor had developed, somewhere in the long eons of its existence, something that functioned like a compulsion, an obsession with organic matter, that served no purpose in terms of its actual sustenance, but which it pursued regardless, with an intensity that suggested the compulsion had become its defining characteristic. When the Necrons destroyed the Citan, Landuagor was among those shattered. The process was, in this particular case, imperfect. When Landuagor was broken apart, it did not simply split into contained shards like other Citan. Instead, something of its essential nature, the compulsion, the obsession, the drive toward flesh, escaped into the Necron bodies doing the shattering. It entered the necrodermis. It found purchase in the crystal matrices of engrams. It began to spread. The Flayer virus, as it came to be known, is a corruption that works its way through Necron engrams and rewrites them. It does not destroy engrams, the way degradation does. It does something more terrible. It preserves them, but twists them. It takes the memories and personality structures of a Necron and infuses them with Yandugor's ancient, purposeless hunger. It makes the Necron remember what flesh felt like. And this is the horrifying core of it, because Necrons no longer have flesh, no longer feel warmth, no longer experience the bodily sensations of organic life. And then it makes them desperate to get those sensations back by any means available. The flayed ones, the Necrons who have succumbed to the Flayer virus, are among the most disturbing sights in the entirety of Warhammer 40,000, a setting not exactly short of disturbing sights. They wear the skins of their victims. They tear living creatures apart with claws that extrude from their necrodermis fingers and drape themselves in the biological material, the flesh and tissue and organic warmth of the murdered. They stalk the shadows of tomb complexes and infiltrate enemy positions, not for any tactical purpose, not out of strategic calculation, but because the virus drives them toward organic life with an urgency that overrides all other programming. The masks they wear, the flayed skin draped over metal faces, the organic material stretched across structures that it was never meant to fit, do not warm them. They cannot warm them. The necrodermis beneath the flesh is incapable of feeling warmth in any biological sense. The virus that drives the flayed ones to collect flesh does not give them back the sensation of flesh. It only drives them toward it, endlessly, hopelessly, in a parody of the longing that the same Necrons also experience but manage, barely, to contain. Necron society does not know what to do with the flayed ones. They are militarily useful, in a narrow sense. They are excellent at causing terror. They can phase through walls and emerge from unexpected angles. They fight with feral, uncalculating ferocity that is actually quite effective against enemies expecting the cold precision of normal Necron warfare. And in the darkest corners of Necron military doctrine, there are commanders who deploy flayed ones deliberately, using the horror they generate as a psychological weapon. But every Necron society that contains flayed ones is forced, on some level, to confront them as a mirror of its own greatest fear. The flayed ones are not enemies. They are not invaders. They are members of the family who went wrong, companions from the old world who caught something that cannot be cured and cannot be halted, only managed. And managing them means making decisions about beings who were once persons and are now something that defies easy categorization. Still Necron in body, still retaining fragments of their former engrams, still identifiable as individuals they were, but twisted, broken in a way that goes beyond the mere damage of engram degradation. At least a mindless Necron is empty. At least a Necron consumed by engram degradation is simply less than they were. The flayed ones are not empty. They are full of something wrong, full of a hunger that is not theirs, animated by a drive implanted by a dead god's dying curse. They are in there, the person they were, still running inside the corrupted matrix, experiencing from the inside the nightmare of being driven by a compulsion they cannot control. This is speculation, of course. No one has successfully had a conversation with a flayed one about their subjective experience. But the behavioral evidence suggests that the original personality is not entirely gone. Flayed ones sometimes behave in ways that suggest residual memory, returning to places they frequented when sane, reacting to objects with what might be recognition, occasionally engaging in behaviors that seem to reflect habits or preferences they had before the corruption took hold. The person is still there, in the machine. The person is trapped, watching from inside, as Londu Gor's hunger drives the body toward acts of horror. The Bone Kingdom of Drazak deserves special mention here, because it is perhaps the most complete example of what a civilization looks like when it has fully accommodated the Flayer virus, rather than simply managing its presence at the margins. Drazak is an entire world given over to the Flayers. Its ruler, Valgul the Fallen, is himself deeply infected, a Necron lord who chose to remain among his corrupted followers rather than abandon them, whose own transformation advanced to the point where he is as much flayed one as Necron lord, existing in a strange transitional state that horrifies other Necrons who encounter him. Drazak is, in one reading, a nightmare, an entire civilizational project built around accommodating a disease rather than curing it, organized around the needs and compulsions of beings driven by something they cannot control. In another reading, it is something stranger, almost poignant. Valgul remains, in some vestigial sense, a lord. He governs, after a fashion. He organizes. The Bone Kingdom functions within the horrifying parameters of what it is. There is something in that, some flicker of the Necron-tier's extraordinary civilization-building instinct, some remnant of the culture that once built ossuaries of remarkable beauty and developed philosophies of impermanence. That has survived even the Flayer corruption and found a grotesque expression in the organization of a kingdom of monsters. The Necrons who are not flayed ones fear the virus in a specific particular way that is worth articulating clearly. They fear it the way one fears contagion. The Flayer virus spreads. It spreads through proximity to flayed ones. It spreads through contact with infected necrodermis. It spreads through mechanisms that are not entirely understood, which makes the fear worse, because unknown vectors of transmission are harder to avoid than known ones. Any Necron who fights alongside flayed ones, or encounters them in the narrow halls of a tomb complex, is, to some degree, at risk. And the risk is not just physical destruction, which can be repaired. The risk is transformation. The risk is becoming a flayed one while still being yourself, while still having enough engram integrity to understand what is happening to you, to feel the compulsion taking hold, to watch your own behavior becoming alien to you as Londu Gor's hunger eclipses your own personality, to be present for your own corruption. The cryptechs study the Flayer virus with the intense focus of researchers who understand that they are not working on an abstract problem, but on something that could, if they are unlucky or careless, happen to them. There is no known cure. There are treatments, ways of slowing the progression, ways of managing the symptoms in early stages, ways of quarantining the infected before the virus can spread further. But the cure, the thing that would actually excise Londu Gor's legacy from Necron civilization entirely, remains elusive. And this too is part of the fear. Not just the fear of becoming a flayed one, but the deeper fear embedded in the virus's existence. The confirmation that Necron bodies, for all their extraordinary engineering, for all their necrodermis durability and crystalline precision, are not safe. They can be invaded. They can be corrupted. The physical perfection of the metal body does not protect the engrams from intrusion. Biotransference promised safety, promised freedom from the vulnerability of flesh. And the Flayer virus demonstrates, in the most visceral way possible, that the promise was not fully kept. The flesh is gone, but vulnerability remains. That is Londugor's last laugh, echoing through 60 million years of Necron history, and it has never stopped being funny to whatever remains of a dead god's cruel intent. Section 5. The Spiral into Nothing. The Destroyer Curse. There is a philosophical position, held by a very small number of beings in the galaxy, that goes something like this. Existence itself is the problem, not suffering, not loss, not the particular horrors that fill a given life or a given civilization. Existence, the whole enterprise of being alive, or being active, or being conscious, depending on how you want to frame it for entities that blur the line between those concepts, is, at its core, a mistake, a cosmic error, a process that generates suffering as its primary output and meaning as a vanishingly rare, probably illusory byproduct. The only honest response to this diagnosis, if you genuinely believe it, is to work toward the end of existence in the most thorough way available to you. Most beings who reach this conclusion are suffering from something. Depression, trauma, the accumulated weight of experience that has ground away at their capacity for hope until nothing remains. The conclusion is a symptom. It is, in clinical terms, a distorted reading of reality produced by a mind in crisis. For the destroyers, it is not a symptom. It is a philosophy. A carefully considered, logically constructed, internally consistent worldview arrived at through something that genuinely resembles rational analysis. And that is what makes it so much more disturbing than ordinary nihilism. Not that the destroyers are in crisis, but that they are, in their own estimation, entirely fine. They have simply reached a conclusion that other Necrons find intolerable, and they are acting on it with the methodical precision of beings who have thought it through very carefully and remain fully committed to their position. The Destroyer Curse, sometimes called the Eater of Hope, sometimes simply the Curse, is not, technically speaking, a virus in the way the Flayer virus is. It is not a transmitted pathogen that invades engrams and rewrites them. It is, rather, a philosophical contagion, a drift in the fundamental orientation of a Necron's engrams toward a particular set of conclusions that then generate a particular set of behaviors. Whether it is better understood as a form of very extreme engram degradation, a psychological consequence of extended immortality, or something more mysterious that involves the residual influence of chitin ideology, the ancient hunger of the destroyers for a galaxy scoured clean, a drive that predates even the war in heaven, is a matter of debate among Necron scholars. What is not debated is what it produces. Destroyers, Necrons who have been overtaken by the curse, seek the extinction of all life, not the domination of life, which many Necron dynasties pursue. Not the strategic elimination of particular threats, which is entirely rational behavior for a military force. The extinction of all life, everywhere, completely and permanently. Organic life in particular, though the most advanced destroyers have been known to turn on Necron targets when organic prey is unavailable. Everything that lives, in their worldview, should die. Everything that exists should be unmade. The galaxy should be quiet and still and clean, stripped of the noise and complexity and chaos that organic existence generates. The weapon systems they employ reflect this philosophy with remarkable completeness. Gauss weaponry, standard to most Necron forces, works by molecularly disassembling targets. It is efficient, precise, and lethal, but it does not represent excess. Destroyers use different weapons. Their cannons are built for maximum destruction radius, for area denial, for the transformation of populated environments into sterile voids. Their personal weapons are built to kill in volume rather than with precision. They do not want to kill the soldier. They want to kill the world the soldier is standing on. Many Necron dynasties deploy destroyers. They are effective. Their desire to eliminate everything in their path translates, in the contained context of a pitched battle, into extraordinary offensive power. A unit of destroyers has no interest in holding positions, or securing objectives, or taking prisoners, or exercising any form of tactical restraint whatsoever. They simply advance and kill until everything they can reach is dead. and then they look for more things to kill. From a narrow, purely military perspective, this is enormously useful. But the Necrons who deploy destroyers are also afraid of them, not in the way that a commander fears an unreliable unit, though there is that too, in a deeper way, in the way that you fear something that reminds you of where you might end up. Because the destroyer curse is not a rare mutation, it is not something that happens to one Necron in a million through some freak of engram corruption. It is a drift that becomes more likely, not less, the longer a Necron has existed. Extended immortality, particularly the extended immortality of the kind the Necrons are experiencing, millennia upon millennia of warfare and sleep, and waking in a galaxy that increasingly does not resemble the one they came from, creates conditions in which the destroyer curse can take hold in almost any Necron whose engrams have not been very carefully maintained. The logic is accessible if you follow the path the curse follows through a declining engram structure. The Necrons exist, they fight, they watch things they have built be destroyed. They watch allies and rivals and companions be destroyed, then rebuilt, then slowly degraded, then fall to mindlessness or the Flayer virus or the destroyer curse itself. They win battles, and the winning produces nothing that persists, because the galaxy's wars do not end, and each victory is simply a pause before the next engagement. They accumulate centuries of experience in which existence, for all the dynasty politics and the war and the recovery of ancient tombs, seems to lack any final justification, any destination, any point. And at some moment, for some Necrons it comes after 1,000 years, for others after 10,000, for the most resilient after much longer, the accumulation of this pointlessness tips the balance. The engrams that maintain the orientation toward purpose, toward dynasty, toward the long-term project of Necron recovery and restoration begin to fail, and into the space they leave, the curse enters. The destroyer cult has a hierarchy of its own, a dark mirror of normal Necron dynasty structure. At the bottom are the basic destroyers, Necrons who have surrendered to the curse and now ride modified chassis optimized for mobile devastation, their lower bodies replaced entirely with weapon platforms that carry them across battlefields at speed. Above them are the heavy destroyers, who have invested even more of their physical form in the pursuit of destruction, their weapons scaled to crack vehicle armor and fortifications. At the apex of the cult are the destroyer lords, Necrons of high rank who have been overtaken by the curse, and now combine the strategic intelligence of former dynasty leaders with the annihilatory drive of the curse. They are, arguably, the most dangerous individual Necrons in existence. The tactical brilliance of a former overlord, pointed entirely at the destruction of everything. The Necron dynasties that have to manage the destroyer cult within their own ranks do so with a combination of pragmatic deployment and carefully contained horror. The destroyers are pointed at the enemy as often as possible. They are kept in sealed sections of the tomb complex when not deployed, areas that other Necrons avoid not out of formal prohibition, but out of a deep, instinctive reluctance to be near something that represents such a total failure of the Necron project, because that is what the Destroyer Curse ultimately represents. The Necron Project's self-refutation. The Necron tier became the Necrons to live forever. The Necrons sleep and wake and fight and accumulate millennia of experience. And the destination of that accumulation, for a meaningful portion of them, is the conclusion that nothing should exist at all. Immortality, it turns out, does not guarantee meaning. It guarantees duration. And duration without meaning is, at sufficient length, indistinguishable from its own particular kind of torture. The Necrons fear the destroyers the way they fear a mirror that shows them not what they are, but what they might become. To understand the Destroyer Curse in full depth, it helps to think about the specific shape of the existence that produces it. The Necrons do not simply live a long time in the way that, say, an Eldar lives a long time, aging very slowly, accumulating experience across centuries, but doing so within a continuous stream of living experience that provides ongoing richness and novelty. The Necrons live in enormous blocks of unconsciousness punctuated by episodes of activity, 60 million years of total sleep, then decades of active war, then possibly another long dormancy as the dynasty consolidates or withdraws, then active deployment again. This pattern creates a particular form of discontinuity that the Destroyer Curse exploits. Each time a Necron wakes, It wakes into a galaxy that has changed while it slept. Companions it remembered may have degraded beyond recognition. Political structures it understood may have evolved in directions it cannot map onto anything familiar. Wars it thought it was fighting have been resolved or replaced by different wars with different enemies over different territory for reasons that connect only loosely, if at all, to the wars it remembers. Every awakening is, to some degree, a disorientation, a moment of reaching for context and finding that the context has shifted. For Necrons of strong engram integrity, those with rich, well-maintained personality matrices, this disorientation can be processed. They adapt. They assess the new situation, update their models, reintegrate. It takes time and cognitive energy, but they manage it. Over centuries of repeated waking, they develop coping mechanisms, ways of anchoring their sense of self in the parts of their experience that do not change between sleeps, their core values, their dynastic obligations, their fundamental orientation toward the universe. But for Necrons whose engrams are already under strain, already degraded, already simplified, already losing the richness that makes adaptation possible, each awakening is harder. The contextual update that the stronger Necrons perform with relative efficiency becomes for the more fragile something closer to rebuilding from rubble. They wake disoriented and cannot fully orient. They find themselves in situations they cannot map and reach for the compass of their values and find it pointing somewhere they no longer entirely understand. It is in that specific state, the state of repeated disorientation without the cognitive resources to successfully reintegrate, that the destroyer curse most readily takes hold. When the complex, nuanced, forward-looking personality structures that maintain purpose and direction begin to fail, the simplest possible summary of the Necron experience asserts itself. And the simplest possible summary, arrived at through cold analysis of what their long existence has actually consisted of, is not comforting. It is the record of a species that has lost everything that mattered, that fights wars that produce no lasting peace, that wakes again and again into a galaxy that does not want them and does not have a place for them, and that carries the weight of a mistake so ancient and so total that no amount of fighting has come close to addressing it. The Destroyer Curse is, in a grotesque way, a philosophy of complete honesty. It has stripped away every comforting layer, every dynasty narrative, every story about recovery and restoration, every hope about biotransference reversal, and arrived at the bare metal reality underneath. And the bare metal reality is, this existence is not what anyone would choose. The duration is not worth the cost. Everything should end. Most Necrons maintain enough cognitive complexity to recognize that this analysis, while not entirely wrong in its identification of real horrors, is drastically incomplete, that it has filtered out everything that makes existence worthwhile and retained only what makes it painful, and that this selective filtering is itself a symptom of the degradation that produced the analysis. The Destroyer's philosophy is not wisdom. It is what wisdom looks like after everything that makes wisdom more than nihilism has been stripped away. But knowing this intellectually does not make the Destroyer Curse less frightening. You cannot simply argue your way out of a process that is happening to your engrams rather than to your reasoning. The Destroyers are not persuadable. They have moved beyond the level at which persuasion operates. And so the Necron dynasties manage them. They contain them, they point them at the enemy, and they hope that what happened to those poor broken warriors does not, through some gradual terrible process, happen to them as well. Section 6, The God That Went Mad, The Outsider. We have talked about internal fears, the corruption of the self, the slow dissolution of identity, the philosophical abyss that awaits at the end of unending existence. Now, let us turn to something external, something that exists out there in the cold between the stars, that the Necrons do not speak of if they can avoid it, that sits in the peripheral vision of Necron strategic awareness, like a shape too large and too wrong to look at directly. Let us talk about the outsider. Among the Chitin, those stellar entities whose manipulation set in motion everything we have already discussed, there was one that stood apart from the others even before the war in heaven. The one the Necrons call Zara Noga, the outsider. The Chitin had their own politics, their own alliances and rivalries, their own complex dynamics born of billions of years of sharing a galaxy. They were not a unified force. They competed for feeding grounds, disputed territories, occasionally warred against one another in conflicts that lasted eons and consumed vast amounts of stellar energy. It was into this already complex situation that the Eldar, old enemies of the Necrons, allies of the Chitin in more complex ways than anyone would fully admit, introduced a particular manipulation. The story, as it has survived in Necron records, is this. The outsider was manipulated by parties the records implicate as including the Eldar trickster god, Segurak, the laughing god, the great manipulator of Eldar myth, into devouring other Chitin. It consumed its fellow star gods. It ate them. And in doing so, in incorporating the wildly alien and incompatible consciousness fragments of multiple godlike beings into a single entity, it lost whatever coherence it had possessed before. The outsider broke, not into fragments, the way other Chitin were broken by Necron weapons, not into contained shards suitable for use as power sources. It shattered psychologically, in a way that left the physical entity intact, while the consciousness that ran it became something that does not map onto any word in any language that was not designed specifically to describe a god's mind in the process of catastrophic failure. Tsaranoga, the outsider, is insane, profoundly, entirely, and in ways that are qualitatively different from mortal madness, because it is a cosmic entity going mad on a cosmic scale. Its behavior is not random in the way that would make it merely chaotic. It is stranger than random. It is an intelligence of extraordinary power, operating according to rules that no external observer has been able to identify, driven by objectives that change without pattern, pursuing goals that contradict each other without apparent awareness of the contradiction. And the Necrons have it contained, barely. After the war in heaven, after the Chitin were shattered and their fragments imprisoned, the outsider was a special case. You cannot shatter something that has already shattered itself. The Chitin in their intact state were vulnerable to specific Necron weapons designed to exploit the particular quality of their existence. As beings of pure energy, the outsider, fragmented and incoherent in its own consciousness, did not present the same target. The Necrons could not shatter what was already in pieces. They could not contain it in a tesseract labyrinth, the way they contained other Chitin shards, because the outsider's fractured nature made it incompatible with standard containment. What they could do, what they did, at enormous cost, through engineering projects of truly spectacular ambition, was isolated. The outsider is imprisoned, if that word even applies, within a Dyson sphere, not a conventional structure, not a shell of metal around a star, but something that uses principles of physics that the broader galaxy is not aware are possible. A dimensional cage built around a stellar body, layers of reality warping machinery designed to cut the outsider off from the rest of the universe by the most thorough isolation technology the Necrons possessed. The outsider is in there. It has been in there for millions of years. It presumably knows it is in there. And it is, by definition, a being of such power that no Necron is fully confident the containment will hold forever. This is the fear. Not that the outsider will be released by some external actor who finds its prison and opens it, though that fear exists too, and has driven Necron policy in ways that are not always explicable by other factors. The deeper fear is simpler and more fundamental. The cage is old. The machinery requires maintenance. The principles on which the containment rests were developed 60 million years ago by scientists whose work has never been fully replicated or fully understood by their successors. The records of exactly how the Dyson Sphere prison works are incomplete. Some were lost during the Great Sleep, some were stored on tomb worlds that never successfully reactivated, some were encoded in systems that have since degraded. The Necrons who maintain the outsider's prison are, in important respects, maintaining machinery they do not entirely understand, according to specifications they do not entirely have. Every cryptech who has studied the outsider's containment has reached the same conclusion. They are managing an ongoing crisis with incomplete tools. They are keeping the lid on something they cannot fully see into, using methods they cannot fully verify, with the knowledge that the thing inside is not simply waiting passively, but is almost certainly doing something. Though what it is doing, and whether it constitutes an attempt at escape or simply the meaningless thrashing of a broken mind, is impossible to determine from the outside. There is a theory, held by a small number of cryptechs who have studied the deeper patterns of galactic history and found some unsettling correlations, that the outsider may have had something to do with the Tyranids. The idea runs roughly as follows. The Tyranids come from beyond the galaxy. Something beyond the galaxy, something vast and ancient and intelligent after a fashion, sent them, or attracted them, toward the Milky Way. The outsider was exiled beyond the galactic rim long before its imprisonment in the Dyson sphere. The nature of the Tyranid hive mind, the quality of its absolute collective consciousness, its utter imperviousness to individual identity, these share certain formal properties with the description of the outsider's fractured multiple consciousness. This theory is deeply speculative. The cryptecs who advance it are careful to note that correlation is not causation, and that they are working from extremely limited data. But the silence with which the Silent King's advisors greet this theory, when it is presented to them, is not the silence of dismissal. It is the silence of people who have already considered this possibility and do not enjoy thinking about it. The outsider represents a particular category of fear for the Necrons that is worth naming carefully, the fear of something they themselves created, or rather, the fear of a consequence they themselves set in motion, that is now beyond their ability to control. They broke the chitin. It was the right decision, the necessary decision, the only decision that could have freed them from slavery. But the breaking produced consequences they could not fully predict and cannot fully manage. The outsider is one of those consequences. The flare virus is another. The imprisoned chitin shards scattered across the galaxy, occasionally escaping their containment and wreaking localized catastrophe, are others. The Necrons are the architects of their own nightmares. They built the cage, and they are afraid of what is inside it, and they are also afraid that they are the ones who put it there and might, through their own ancient decisions, be responsible for whatever it does when it finally gets out. That fear has a specific quality. It is not the clean fear of something coming for you from outside. It is the queasy, complicated fear of a consequence returning, of a bill coming due, of the moment when you discover that you did not, in fact, escape what you thought you had escaped. You only moved it further down the road, where it has been accumulating interest. The outsider is out there, contained for now, mad, forever, and the Necrons are afraid of the day their maintenance logs will show a deviation they cannot correct. The Eldar's role in the outsider's creation is worth dwelling on, because it adds a dimension to the Necrons' fear that goes beyond simple existential dread. It suggests something about the nature of the war the Necrons are fighting, not just against enemies in the conventional sense, but against the consequences of cosmic-scale manipulation that was conducted without their awareness or consent, and whose effects they are still managing millions of years later. Segorach, the laughing god of the Eldar, is one of the few divine entities in the Warhammer 40,000 setting who could plausibly be described as clever rather than simply powerful. The Eldar gods are not the Chaos gods. They are not entities of vast psychic energy, sustained by the belief and emotion of billions of followers, not beings who can directly reshape reality on a whim. They are survivors, remnants of the ancient Eldar pantheon who found ways to persist while their kin were destroyed by the birth of Slaanesh. Segorach survived specifically by being impossible to catch, by hiding in plain sight, by making every interaction a performance with multiple layers of meaning, by turning every apparent defeat into an eventual setup for something else. The manipulation of the outsider is precisely this kind of multi-layered operation. From one angle, it benefits the Eldar. It removes a chitin who was hostile to all organic life, who would happily have consumed the Eldar as readily as anything else. From another angle, it creates a problem for the Necrons that they will be managing essentially forever. From a third angle, it establishes the precedent that the Necrons' greatest victories, the shattering of the chitin, were shaped by forces working at angles the Necrons could not see. This is uncomfortable for a civilization that prides itself on foresight, planning, and analytical precision. The Necrons do not like to discover, after the fact, that they were a piece in someone else's game. The discovery that their campaign against the chitin, their greatest triumph, may have been partly engineered by Eldar manipulation, that Segorach was somewhere laughing while the Necrons executed what they believed was their own righteous revenge, is deeply unwelcome, and the fear it generates is specific and practical. If it happened then, it could happen again. The Necrons' analytical models, for all their sophistication, cannot model the Laughing God, because the Laughing God exists specifically to resist modeling. Every apparently settled situation might have another layer, Every apparent victory might be contributing to an outcome that serves someone else's purposes entirely. The outsider in its cage is the monument to this fear. It stands as proof that the Necrons cannot fully know the context of their own history, that there are actors in the universe whose manipulation is subtle enough to penetrate even their defenses. That absolute certainty, which the Necron analytical tradition aspires to, is not available. For 60 million years, that has been a hard lesson. It has not gotten easier. Section 7. The Great Devourer. Why the Tyranids keep the Silent King awake. There are threats that the Necrons understand. The Imperium of Man, vast, tenacious, impossible to fully extinguish, capable of throwing billions of soldiers at any problem regardless of the personal cost, is a threat the Necrons understand. They have protocols for it. They have tactical doctrines developed across centuries of reawakening conflict. Human armies, for all their courage and their faith and their extraordinary ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting, are made of flesh. They can be killed. They have supply lines and logistics and morale and political structures. They are, in the deepest strategic sense, manageable. The Eldar, ancient, psychically potent, operating through webs of foresight and manipulation, so complex that even Necron analytical systems struggle to model them fully, are a threat the Necrons understand. The history between the two species is complicated, full of alliance and betrayal and a shared awareness that they are both old enough to remember things the rest of the galaxy has forgotten. The Eldar are dangerous, but they are comprehensible. They want things. They fear things. They can be predicted, at least partially, at least some of the time. Even chaos, that howling void of psychic corruption and divine madness, that dimension of pure emotion and nightmare, is a threat the Necrons can conceptualize, even if they cannot fully model it. The warp is alien to them, incompatible with their nature, impossible to interact with directly. But it is bounded. It has rules, even if those rules are incomprehensibly complex and frequently self-contradictory. The Necrons know where the warp is and roughly what it does and what it wants, insofar as a dimension of raw psychic energy can be said to want anything. The Tyranids are different. The Tyranid hive fleets come from outside the galaxy. They came from the void beyond the rim, from the dark space between galactic clusters, where there are no stars to warm anything and no established civilization to leave any record of passing through. They arrived at the edge of the Milky Way and began to feed. And what they feed on is not just matter, but the specific organic complexity that the Necrons understand as the raw material of everything they have lost. Every world the Tyranids strip, they strip of exactly the kind of biological richness that the Necron tiers gave up in biotransference. Every ecosystem devoured, every species consumed, every gram of organic matter absorbed into the Hive Mind's biomass represents resources that could, in some theoretical far future, contribute to solving the problem that haunts the Necrons most deeply. But this material explanation, while real and significant, does not fully capture why the Necrons, and the Silent King in particular, fear the Tyranids with a depth that goes beyond tactical concern. Cesarek, the Silent King, had spent much of the time since the war in heaven in self-imposed exile. He had witnessed biotransference, had understood what it meant, had turned on the Satan in fury and orchestrated their shattering, and had then, in a gesture of guilt and penance, disbanded the Triarch, the ruling council of the Necron dynasties, and exiled himself, wandering the deep void alone for millions of years. He was not present for the Great Sleep. He was not in the tomb complexes when the galaxy turned its long wheel. He was out there, in the dark between the stars, carrying the weight of what he had done. It was Zarek who first saw the Tyranid hive fleets approach the galaxy. In the void outside the galactic rim, where he had wandered for so long, he encountered the outriders of what would become Hive Fleet Behemoth and Hive Fleet Leviathan and all the others. The first tendrils of a migration so vast that the word invasion barely contains it. He saw what they were. He analyzed what they did. And then the Silent King, who had abandoned his people and his responsibility out of guilt, turned himself around and came home. That decision, to return to the galaxy, to seek out the awakening Necron dynasties, to step back into the role he had abandoned, tells you everything you need to know about how the Necrons regard the Tyranid threat. Cesarek crossed a line he had sworn never to cross again. He returned to involvement, to leadership, to the messy, painful business of being responsible for other people. He did it because the Tyranids were the one thing that could convince him it was necessary. Why are the Tyranids so uniquely threatening to the Necrons? Start with the Hive Mind. The Tyranids are not a collection of individual creatures coordinated by communication. They are, in the most fundamental sense, a single consciousness distributed across trillions of biological bodies, each one an organ of the collective whole. The hive mind does not have allies in politics and personalities that can be exploited. It does not have fear that can be used against it. It does not have supply chains that can be disrupted or morale that can be broken. It has only the singular, unified, implacable drive to consume and grow and consume more. The Necrons are used to fighting enemies with psychology, even the most alien of their opponents. The Orcs with their woe energy, the Eldar with their complex foreknowledge, the demons of chaos with their incomprehensible motivations, have psychology in some form. Something they want, something they fear, something that can be leveraged or manipulated or waited out. The hive mind wants nothing except more biomass. It fears nothing except failure to acquire biomass. It cannot be waited out because it never stops, never sleeps, never loses interest in a target once identified. Furthermore, the Tyranids adapt. This is perhaps the most strategically disturbing quality they possess. An army that faces a Necron force in battle once and is destroyed provides no information that subsequent encounters can use. But the hive mind absorbs the genetic data of its fallen organisms, analyzes it, and breeds its next generation of creatures specifically to counter whatever defeated the previous generation. Over the course of a campaign, the Tyranids evolve. They develop new biological weapons suited specifically to penetrate the particular configurations of Necron armor and shielding they have faced. They grow new kinds of creatures designed to flank Necron tactical formations, to overwhelm their specific defensive doctrines, to do exactly the things that worked last time, less effectively. Necron tactical doctrine, for all its ancient wisdom and strategic depth, was developed over millions of years of fighting enemies that do not adapt biologically in real time. The adaptability of the hive mind is something the Necrons' accumulated doctrine is, in places, genuinely unprepared for. And the Necrons know this. Their cryptechs have studied Tyranid tactical adaptation and published assessments that, translated into frank language, amount to admissions that the scale of the problem exceeds current models. There is also the shadow in the warp. As a Tyranid hive fleet approaches a system, it generates a phenomenon that the Imperium's psychers have called the shadow in the warp, a dampening, suppressing effect on psychic activity that silences warp communication and makes psyker abilities difficult or impossible to use in the affected area. The Necrons are not psychers. They do not use the warp. The shadow should not affect them, but it does, in ways that are subtle and troubling. The shadow is not simply a disruption to psychic communication. At its deepest level, it represents the hive mind's consumption of psychic energy, the literal feeding of the hive fleet on the immaterial residue of sentient life in its target area, the devouring of whatever thin connection living things have to the warp before their bodies are consumed. For a galaxy that contains 6 billion years of accumulated psychic complexity, the shadow represents a kind of silencing that goes beyond tactical inconvenience. It is the harbinger of a galaxy stripped not just of life, but of the psychic dimension of life, of the dreams and prayers and fears and memories that the warp reflects. The Necrons have a complicated relationship with this prospect. On one hand, the warp is their enemy. It is the home of the Satan, the source of chaos corruption, the environment that is fundamentally incompatible with everything they are. A galaxy with less warp activity is, in some narrow sense, a less threatening galaxy for the Necrons. On the other hand, if the Tyranids succeed at their project, there will be no galaxy left, not in any sense that matters. A silent rock orbiting a sun, stripped of every molecule of organic complexity, every creature, every soul, every possibility of the biological life that might, in some unimaginably distant future, provide the resources to undo biotransference. That is not a victory. That is a different kind of extinction, and Sarek knows this. He returned to the galaxy to prevent it. He has declared, in his reserved and formal way, that the Tyranids represent an existential threat not merely to individual planets or civilizations, but to the project of Necron recovery itself, to the slim and desperately maintained hope that what biotransference took might somehow, someday, be given back. The Tyranids cannot be bargained with. They cannot be impressed. They cannot be offered a better deal than the one they are already executing. They cannot be deflected because they have no destination other than forward. They cannot be waited out because waiting means they continue to feed and grow and adapt and multiply. For the Necrons, for beings who have survived for 60 million years through a combination of overwhelming force, strategic patience, superior technology, and the willingness to simply outlast every problem they have ever faced, encountering something that their foundational strategy of patience cannot work against is genuinely, deeply alarming. The Tyranids are the one enemy the Necrons cannot simply wait to go away. That is why the Silent King came home. That is why the Undying are afraid of creatures that live and die and breed and consume across the span of a single campaign. That is why, in the cold calculation of Necron strategic planning, there exists a category labeled something roughly translatable as the unacceptable outcome, and the Tyranid completion of their galactic harvest is what fills it. Section 8. The Howling Dark. Chaos and the Warp. The Necrons do not fear chaos the way the Imperium of Man fears it. This distinction matters because the word fear covers very different experiences depending on who is doing the fearing and what they have at stake. For the Imperium, chaos is an existential terror in the most personal sense, a dimension of psychic energy that can invade a human mind, corrupt it from within, turn loyal servants of the Emperor into agents of destruction, and reach through the veil of reality to recruit champions and spread corruption in ways that no amount of fortification can fully prevent. Every psyker in the Imperium is a potential gateway. Every sufficiently intense emotional experience is a potential invitation. Chaos is intimate with human beings in the way that a cancer is intimate with the body it inhabits. It knows the host's weaknesses because it is made of those weaknesses, because human emotion is literally the raw material of the warp. Necrons have no such vulnerability. They have no psychic presence. They have no souls for demons to corrupt. They cannot be tempted by the whispers of the Chaos Gods, because the Chaos Gods communicate through the warp, and the Necrons have no connection to the warp through which those whispers could arrive. When a demon attempts to possess a Necron body, and there is at least one recorded attempt of this kind, undertaken by a sufficiently desperate and ambitious entity, the result is instructive. The demon finds nothing to inhabit. The necrodermis is simply not a viable host. There is no psychic interface, no emotional architecture to exploit, no immaterial dimension to the Necron body where a parasitic consciousness could anchor itself. The attempt fails, catastrophically for the daemon, and the Necron continues about its business with mechanical indifference. In this sense, chaos cannot harm the Necrons the way it harms everyone else. And this is real. This is not arrogance or self-deception on the Necrons' part. The immunity is genuine, and it has tactical implications that both sides of the Necron chaos conflict account for in their strategic calculations. But here is the problem. The warp is not simply a threat delivery system. It is not merely the medium through which the Chaos Gods communicate their corruption. The warp is a fundamental dimension of reality. It underlies everything. It is the space through which faster-than-light travel occurs for almost every civilization that engages in it. It is the dimension that reflects the psychic and emotional lives of all sentient beings. And through that reflection, it is, in some deep and philosophically difficult sense, the dimension in which the experience of living leaves its mark. The warp is where memory echoes. It is where the dead, for a time at least, persist in some form. It is where the prayers of 10 billion human beings go. It is the dimension in which meaning, if meaning exists anywhere in this universe, takes its most tangible form. The Necrons are cut off from all of this, completely, permanently. They have no access to the warp, cannot navigate it, cannot use it for travel, cannot tap it for psychic power, cannot draw on it in any way. And this is not merely an inconvenience. It is a strategic limitation of enormous practical significance. Consider warp travel. The Imperium's warships can cross vast distances in relatively short subjective time, because they travel through the warp, using the currents and eddies of that psychic dimension to cover in days what would take centuries in real space. The Necrons cannot do this. Necron warships are extraordinarily powerful, among the most technologically advanced vessels in the galaxy, but they travel through real space at sublight speeds, or at best through dimensional fold space that is their own particular version of faster-than-light transit. The galactic distances involved mean that Necron's strategic mobility is fundamentally constrained in ways that warp-capable civilizations are not. A Tyranid hive fleet can arrive from across the galaxy within a campaign season. An Imperium navy can respond to a crisis on the other side of human space in weeks. The Necrons, for all their military power, are anchored to regions of space in ways that their enemies are not. This is not fear in an emotional sense, but it is a limitation that generates something functionally similar: a calculated awareness of vulnerability, an ongoing assessment of constraints that cannot be overcome, a strategic caution born of knowing that certain options available to your enemies are simply not available to you. But there is something stranger and more genuinely disturbing about the Necrons' relationship with chaos, and it involves the Great Rift. In the current era of Warhammer 40,000, the 41st and 42nd millennia, if you are tracking the timeline, a catastrophic event tore the galaxy in half. The Great Rift, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum, is a wound in reality through which the warp bleeds into real space across a vast swath of the galaxy. Vast regions of space have been rendered effectively impassable, cut off from communication, subject to warp storms of such ferocity that even experienced navigators refuse to attempt transit. Worlds that stood for thousands of years have been swallowed by the rift, their populations consumed by demonic incursion or simply cut off from the Imperium they once served. The Necrons have a potential solution to this. Pylon networks, vast arrays of ancient Necron technology, have the demonstrated ability to dampen and suppress warp activity. Individual pylons have been observed weakening demonic presences and calming warp storms in their immediate vicinity. A sufficient network of pylons, activated in coordination, could theoretically seal the Great Rift, could stitch the wound shut, could reduce the galaxy's warp exposure to something approaching pre-rift levels, could accomplish in weeks or months what the Imperium has spent centuries attempting, with prayer and sacrifice and titanic military expenditure. Sarek is aware of this. He has the data. The capability exists. But sealing the Great Rift would have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate tactical benefit. The warp is not only a conduit for chaos corruption, it is the psychic dimension in which psyker abilities are rooted. An active pylon network strong enough to close the rift would suppress psychic activity across the galaxy. Every human psyker would lose access to their abilities. Eldar seers would go blind to future visions. The astropathic networks through which the Imperium communicates would fall silent. The navigator houses that guide ships through the warp would become useless. Every civilization in the galaxy that depends on warp travel or psychic communication would be crippled, possibly fatally. Sarek has not activated the pylon network. He has not explained, in any recorded communication, exactly why. But the inference is available. The cost is too high. The Necrons closing the rift would, in effect, cut every other civilization in the galaxy off from a dimension of reality they depend on for survival in order to solve a problem that, while severe, is primarily a problem for those civilizations, rather than for the Necrons themselves. And in that decision, in the choice not to do the thing that would most benefit the Necrons at catastrophic cost to everyone else, there is something interesting. Something that suggests the Silent Kings feared the reaction, feared the consequences, or feared something about the morality of the choice itself. And each of those possible interpretations says something different and equally fascinating about what the Necrons are afraid of. The Chaos Gods themselves regard the Necrons with something that functions like disgust. Tzinch, the Chaos God of change, magic, and scheming, finds the Necrons particularly irritating because they exist entirely outside the matrices of fate and possibility that Tzinch navigates with such facility. You cannot see the future of something that has no psychic presence. You cannot scheme with or against something you cannot perceive in the warp. The Necrons are blind spots in Tzinch's vision, which means they are also, from Tzinch's perspective, sources of chaotic unpredictability in the most authentic sense. things that happen without being predictable, that change outcomes without being visible causes of those changes. Nurgle, who loves all life and all decay, has essentially no interest in the Necrons at all. There is nothing to rot. There is no biological complexity to corrupt. The Plague Father's attention passes over necrodermis, the way water passes over stone. Khorne, who cares only for violence and the spilling of blood, has a more straightforward relationship with the Necrons. They kill things. He approves of things that kill things. The question of whether Necron kills generate the psychic resonance that Khorne's power feeds on is interesting and unresolved, but the practical implication is that Khorne worshippers tend to view Necrons as worthy enemies in a way the other Chaos gods do not. Slaanesh, the god of sensation and excess, is perhaps the most completely uninterested in the Necrons. Beings that cannot feel have nothing that Slaanesh can take from them, and nothing that Slaanesh's servants can offer them. The Necrons' fear of chaos, then, is not the intimate, personal, corrupting fear that humans experience. It is a strategic fear, the fear of a force that can reshape reality, that can make the galaxy uninhabitable for the organic life the Necrons need to preserve, that generates enemies of genuine power whose motivations cannot be predicted by any rational model. The Chaos gods are not rational, and the Necrons, whose entire civilization is built on the application of extraordinarily advanced rational calculation to every problem, find irrationality at galactic scale genuinely, deeply unsettling. You cannot model a god that doesn't obey the rules. You cannot win a war against an enemy that doesn't want anything comprehensible. You cannot outlast a force that is, in the most literal sense, made of the very thing you cannot access or influence. The howling dark of the warp is not the Necrons' greatest fear, but it is a dark they cannot enter, cannot navigate, cannot illuminate. And for beings who have illuminated everything else, that darkness has its own particular weight. Section 9. The dream that cannot come true. The fear of irreversibility. Let us talk about hope for a moment, because understanding what the Necrons hope for is essential to understanding what they fear most. Among the Necrons who have retained sufficient personality to be capable of wanting things, and not all of them have, but enough do that it constitutes a consistent strand in Necron culture, there is a hope. It is not a hope that gets spoken about in public. It is not a hope that appears in formal dynasty declarations or military proclamations or the speeches that pharaohs deliver over the bodies of their fallen soldiers. But it is there, in the private thoughts of countless Necron lords and cryptechs and overlords who have spent enough time reviewing their own memories to understand what they have lost, and to wonder if it might, somehow, be recovered. The hope is this, that biotransference can be reversed, that somewhere, in the 60 million years of accumulated knowledge that the Necron dynasties carry, or in the ruins of Old One civilization scattered across the galaxy, or in the minds of the Satan shards who still understand things about the nature of matter and energy and consciousness that no other being in the galaxy has access to, somewhere, somehow, there is an answer, a method, a technology or a ritual or a principle that would allow the Necrons to rebuild what was stripped from them, to recover their souls, to return to flesh or to something that approximates flesh closely enough to matter, to be alive again, not just functional. The Nephric dynasty, the Golden dynasty, the dynasty that moves through light and whose warriors can phase through solid matter, has made this hope into something approaching a formal research agenda. They are actively seeking what the other dynasties only quietly fantasize about. Their cryptechs investigate every lead, every recovered artifact, every fragment of Old One technology that might suggest a path toward reversal. Their Pharaon has declared that the restoration of true life for the Necron people is not merely a personal preference, but a dynastic imperative. They pursue it with a systematic energy that the rest of Necron society finds either inspiring or uncomfortable, depending on the observer's own level of hope. But here is the fear that shadows this hope so closely that the two are almost impossible to separate. The fear that reversal is not possible, that biotransference was truly irreversible, that the souls consumed by the Satan 60 million years ago are gone in a way that admits no recovery, no reconstruction, no approximation, that the Necrontier are dead, actually dead, in the deepest sense, and what remains is a collection of very sophisticated machines that remember being people but cannot, in any meaningful philosophical sense, become people again. This fear is not abstract. It is grounded in the Necrons' own extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of the physical and metaphysical universe. They know more about how consciousness works, how souls form and persist and dissipate, than almost any other civilization in the galaxy. They helped build the universe's current state, in a sense. They were there at the beginning of the current age, and their knowledge, applied honestly to their own situation, generates assessments that are not optimistic. The souls are gone. The chitin consumed them. The consumed energy is distributed through the chitin fragments scattered across the galaxy, degraded, mixed with other consumed energies, no longer organized into anything that could be called individual consciousness. Even if every chitin shard were somehow recovered and its stored energy analyzed and extracted, the specific patterns that made a specific Necron tire a specific person would be irretrievably scrambled, irrecoverably lost. This is the Cryptek's honest assessment, when pressed, and when there is no political reason to offer a more comforting answer. So, the Nephrek dynasty's research program is not really seeking to recover lost souls. It is seeking to create new ones. To develop a technology that would allow the engineering of genuine consciousness, not the echo of personality in crystal matrices, but something that connects to the warp, something that casts a psychic shadow, something that is alive in the way mortal beings are alive, rather than functional in the way machines are functional. And this is an even harder problem than soul recovery, because it requires creating from scratch something that the universe produces through the enormous, complex, billions of years long process of biological evolution and psychic development. The Necrons are trying to build what the old ones grew, on a timeline that the urgency of their situation demands be much, much shorter. Whether it is possible, no one knows. The research continues. The hope persists. But the fear persists alongside it. The specific gnawing fear that every year of research that produces no breakthrough, every promising lead that dead ends, every reassessment that concludes the problem is harder than previously understood, might be evidence not of a problem awaiting a solution, but of a problem that has no solution. There is a particular quality to this fear that distinguishes it from the fear of death or the fear of destruction. If you are afraid of death, you can fight. You can defend yourself, fortify your position, develop better armor and better weapons and better medical technology. You can delay death. You can make it harder to achieve. The action of fighting against death is available to you. But if you are afraid that what you lost cannot be recovered, if the fear is not that the enemy is coming, but that the thing you need most simply does not exist to be found, there is nothing you can do with that fear except carry it. The Necrons carry it with extraordinary composure. They continue to function. They fight their wars, maintain their dynasties, pursue their politics, execute their military campaigns with the precision that 60 million years of warfare has perfected. The fear does not disable them. But it is there, in the calculations of every Cryptek who honestly reviews the research data, in the quiet moments of Pharaons whose personality matrices are intact enough to feel something like despair, in the particular quality of patience that Sarek demonstrates when he speaks of the Necron people's future. A patience that is very close, if you listen carefully, to the stillness of a being who is not sure there is a destination to be patient toward. There is also a connected fear that deserves mention here. The fear that the question itself cannot be answered. Not that the answer is no, but that the question is permanently open, that the Necrons will pursue the possibility of reversal forever without ever being able to definitively prove or disprove it, and that this permanent uncertainty will be the condition in which they must live until the universe's last star goes cold. For beings who prefer, in their deepest nature, clarity, who were engineered for precision, whose civilization is built on the application of rational analysis to every problem, the prospect of permanent unresolvable uncertainty about the most important question they face is its own particular horror. Not the horror of a definite no. The horror of a maybe that never becomes either yes or no. The dream that cannot be confirmed, the hope that cannot be verified, the fear that lives in the space between. The fear of irreversibility also manifests in a more immediate, less cosmic way in the daily experience of individual Necrons. The fear of decisions that cannot be undone. In mortal life, most decisions are reversible in some sense. You can change course, you can move on, you can repair relationships or abandon them and form new ones, can leave a place and return to it, can revise a strategy that isn't working. The reversibility of most choices is one of the features of mortal existence that, paradoxically, makes existence more bearable. The knowledge that you are not locked in, that the current moment is not the final configuration, that there is room to adjust and correct and grow. Immortal existence changes this in ways that are not intuitive. You might expect that with unlimited time available, every decision would feel low stakes. You can always fix it later, try again, course correct over the next 1,000 years. But this is not how it actually works, for the Necrons, in practice. What unlimited time actually means is that the consequences of decisions accumulate without bound. A choice that sets you on a particular path does not correct itself automatically across the centuries. It compounds. The Necron dynasties that chose, at critical moments in their reawakening, to pursue aggressive expansion rather than careful rebuilding are now committed to a strategic posture that would require enormous effort to change, not because the effort is beyond their capability, but because 60 years of decisions made in a particular context have created structures, alliances, obligations, and enemies that all assume the continuation of the original direction. You cannot simply declare a new strategy. You have to unwind everything that the original strategy has built. Multiply this across millions of years, across decisions made by individuals who have since degraded or gone mindless or been destroyed, across political commitments made in contexts that no longer exist to beings who are no longer around to renegotiate them. And the weight of irreversibility becomes something genuinely oppressive. The Necron dynasties are, in many ways, more constrained by their history than most civilizations, precisely because their history is longer and its decisions have had more time to compound. And at the center of all of this accumulated constraint sits the original decision, the one that started everything, the one that Sarek cannot undo no matter how many battles he wins or how many careful plans he executes, the decision to proceed with biotransference. He did not make it lightly. He did not make it foolishly. He made it in extremity, with incomplete information, manipulated by a being of godlike cunning. By every reasonable moral standard applicable to mortal beings in impossible situations, he should be forgiven. By every analytical framework that looks at the information available to him at the time and the desperate circumstances he faced, the decision was defensible. He does not forgive himself. He will not. Perhaps because he does not believe defensible and right are the same thing. Perhaps because the consequences are too severe to be absolved by the reasonableness of the process that led to them. Perhaps simply because he is the kind of being who believes that responsibility does not have a statute of limitations. That if you authorized an action, you own its consequences forever, regardless of the mitigating factors, regardless of how long ago it happened. The fear of irreversibility is, at its deepest, the fear that being sorry is not the same as being able to fix it. And for Sarek, for every Necron who has enough engram integrity to understand what was done and what was lost, that fear never goes away. It sits alongside every other thought, a constant presence, a permanent acknowledgement of the gap between what was intended and what occurred. They endure. The undying always endure. But endurance for the Necrons has a particular flavor that distinguishes it from the endurance of beings who have not paid the specific price the Necrons paid. It is the endurance of people who know exactly what they gave up, who are reminded of it constantly by the cold metal nature of their own existence, and who continue anyway. Not because it is easy, not because the knowledge has faded, but because continuing is the only path that might, someday, somewhere, lead somewhere better. That is the hope that makes the fear bearable, just barely. But barely is enough. Section 10. The silence of the deep halls. The severed worlds. Every Necron dynasty has a home, or had one. The tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy are the foundations of Necron civilization, each one a vast complex of chambers and corridors and workshops and vaults, designed to house sleeping armies and sleeping lords in perfect stasis for whatever span of time the Great Sleep demanded. The plan, always the plan, was that the tombs would open in sequence, their inhabitants waking in a coordinated wave, dynasties reassembling themselves, hierarchy reestablishing itself, the full military and political and cultural weight of Necron civilization reconstituting itself across the galaxy like a flower opening. It did not go entirely according to plan. Some tomb worlds failed to open, Not because of external intervention, not because enemies found them and destroyed them, not because the geology of the host planet changed enough to physically damage the complexes buried beneath the surface. They failed because of internal dysfunction. Because the automated revival systems, the incredibly sophisticated machinery designed to maintain the tomb inhabitants in viable stasis and then wake them in the correct sequence, developed faults over the 60 million year sleep that their designers had never fully accounted for. Revival sequence failures take many forms. In the mildest cases, certain tomb inhabitants wake in incorrect order without the context of their normal chain of command, and spend some time confused before re-establishing proper structure. In more serious cases, revival machinery wakes parts of a dynasty without waking others, leading to incomplete reconstitution in which certain lords and commanders are active while their subordinates remain dormant, or in which entire wings of a tomb continue sleeping while others are fully operational. But there is a category of revival failure that goes beyond these mechanical inconveniences. A category that Necron society does not speak of casually, but which haunts the planning of every dynasty that thinks carefully about its own tomb world infrastructure: the severed worlds. On certain tomb worlds, the number is not known precisely because some severed worlds have not yet been discovered by any active Necron dynasty. The revival sequence completed. The machinery worked exactly as intended. The stasis fields dropped on schedule. The life support systems came online in correct sequence. The power cells provided the energy they were supposed to provide. Everything functioned, but the inhabitants did not wake. Their bodies are operational. The necrodermis functions perfectly, self-repairing, maintaining all physical systems within normal parameters. The mechanical portions of their architecture are fine, but the engrams, the personality matrices, the consciousness structures, the data patterns that should have loaded into the operational necrodermis and produced the experience of waking, are silent, empty, producing no output. The warriors of the severed worlds walk. They patrol their tombs. They respond to intrusion with automated defensive protocols. They maintain the facility and its systems with the functional competence of any operational Necron, but no one is there. Not in the way that mindless Necrons are, no one there. Mindless Necrons have at least lost their engrams through a process that can be identified and understood. The severed are different. Their engrams are present. The data is there. But whatever makes data run, whatever makes encoded information become experience, whatever spark ignites the machinery of consciousness and produces the subjective sensation of being alive, is absent. And no cryptech who has examined these Necrons has been able to identify why. The leading theories involve the extended duration of the Great Sleep, interacting with particularly severe engram degradation in a specific way, not erasing the engrams, but corrupting the interface between the engrams and the Necron body's core processing systems. The engrams exist, intact. The processing systems exist, operational, but the connection between them, the mechanism by which data becomes experience, has failed, and the failure is so complete and so mysterious that it leaves no diagnostic trace. When active Necron explorers enter a severed world's tomb complex, the experience is reported consistently as among the most disturbing they have known. Walking halls that should be alive with the hum of awakening civilization, finding instead operational machinery and walking dead. Necrons that function, that respond to environmental stimuli, that perform their programmed duties with perfect technical competence, but that answer no communication, that have no command hierarchy, that move through the tomb like the hands of a clock, without the clock's internal mechanism to give their movement meaning. The severed walk their patrols and maintain their systems, and will defend their tomb against intruders with lethal force. And they will never, by any means currently known, wake up. Some dynasties have attempted to recover severed worlds, to break into those tombs and do something with the population, integrate them into functional dynasties, find some way to activate whatever is missing. These attempts have not succeeded. The cryptechs cannot find what is broken. You cannot fix something whose failure leaves no visible trace. You cannot restore a connection that is invisible to your instruments. And this is the fear the severed worlds represent, articulated clearly. The possibility that the Necron's immortality is not as secure as it looks. that beneath the operational perfection of necrodermis and crystal matrices and self-repairing physical systems, there is something more fragile, the mysterious, poorly understood, fundamentally irreplaceable quality that makes mechanism into consciousness, that makes data into experience. And that quality can fail silently, completely, without warning, without any indication that anything has gone wrong, until suddenly there is no one left inside the machine. This fear has practical consequences. Necron overlords who know about the severed worlds, and all of the most senior ones do, tend to invest considerable resources in monitoring their own engram integrity. They commission regular deep assessments from their best cryptechs, not just checking for degradation, but specifically checking the interface between engrams and core processing. They institute rigorous protocols for confirming the consciousness status of Necrons returning from extended dormancy. They are, in the most direct sense, afraid of becoming what the severed are. There is also a grief dimension to the severed worlds that exists alongside the fear. These were people. These were Necron tier who made the same terrible sacrifice as every other Necron, who went to sleep with the expectation of waking, who are in every physical sense present and operational and still there, in the tombs they were built for, carrying out their functions with perfect fidelity. And they are, for all meaningful purposes, gone. More gone than the dead, in a way, because the dead have at least completed their trajectory. The severed are frozen at the moment of intended waking, perpetually on the threshold of consciousness, perpetually failing to cross it, the machinery of self executing without the self. What do you do with a planet full of something like that? The answers the Necron dynasties have given to this question range from practical to poignant. Some have deployed severed worlds as purely military assets. Their inhabitants fight effectively enough, and their tomb infrastructure remains functional, and in the cold calculations of dynasty politics, this is resource that can be leveraged regardless of the philosophical horror of the situation. Others have sealed severed worlds, placing navigational hazard markers in their systems, quarantining them from broader Necron space in a gesture that is partly precautionary and partly, one suspects, a form of respect. An acknowledgement that what is happening there deserves to be left alone, not exploited. And some of those sealed worlds continue their silent work, the severed maintaining their tombs, patrolling their halls, performing their functions across the long centuries, in a perpetual almost dawn that never breaks into day. Out there in the dark, patient and operational and empty and endless. The severed worlds are the Necron's private nightmare. They are what happens when the Immortality Project fails in the one way that cannot be repaired, in the one dimension of the Necron experience that has never been fully understood, the invisible bridge between mechanism and mind. The Necrons built the most durable bodies in the history of the galaxy. They built them to last forever. They did not fully understand what they were putting inside them, and without that understanding, forever turns out to be a surprisingly limited guarantee. There is one more dimension to the severed worlds that deserves mention, one that the cryptechs rarely discuss, but that several of them have committed to their private research records. The question of whether the severed experience anything. The analytical answer is no. Without the engram to processing interface functioning, there is no substrate for experience. The body runs its programs, the maintenance routines execute, the patrol patterns play out, but without the animating connection to the engrams, there is no consciousness to have an experience. The lights are off. No one is suffering. No one is waiting. There is simply mechanism, performing function, in silence. This is almost certainly correct. The cryptechs believe it is correct. The technical evidence supports it being correct. But there is a reason the cryptechs file this conclusion in their private records rather than their public ones. There is a reason that Necrons who have visited severed worlds come back from those visits slightly changed, more careful with their own engram maintenance, more attentive to the quality of their own consciousness, quieter in ways that suggest not fear exactly, but a new awareness of the fragility of the thing they are trying to protect. The severed worlds are not frightening because they confirm that the severed are suffering. They are frightening because they confirm that consciousness, the very thing the Necrons have spent 60 million years trying to preserve, can simply stop. Without violence, without degradation, without any visible cause or any warning or any trace. It can simply be there and then not be there, and the universe will continue turning as if it were not the most important thing that could possibly have happened. The universe does not notice. The universe does not care. The tomb continues its functions, and the severed continue their patrol, and from outside there is no difference at all between a severed world and an operational one, until you look very closely and realize that no one answers when you call. That is the fear in its purest form. Not death, not corruption, not transformation. Simply, the light going out without sound, without warning, in the dark between the stars, while everything else continues as normal. Section 11. What fear reveals about the undying. We have come a long way from the opening image. That thought experiment about something that cannot die. The creature we imagined at the start was featureless, abstract, defined entirely by a single quality: invulnerability. It could not die. It was safe. And in its safety, implicitly, it was also free from the suffering that mortality carries with it. The Necrons are what that thought experiment looks like when it meets reality. When the idea of immortality stops being a philosophical convenience and starts being the actual lived experience of actual beings with actual histories, actual losses, actual things to protect, and actual things to dread. When you take the concept of undying and apply it honestly, not to a convenient fiction, not to a simplified model, but to the full irreducible complexity of what it means to be a person with a past and a future, you get the Necrons. And what you find is that immortality does not eliminate fear. It transforms it. Mortal beings fear death, and that fear is rational and useful, and it shapes their behavior in ways that are, on balance, beneficial. The fear of death motivates self-preservation. It motivates the formation of communities and the development of medicine and the writing of literature and every other project that represents mortal beings trying to leave something behind that will outlast them. Fear of death is the engine of mortal civilization. The Necrons have been freed from that particular fear. They cannot die in the way mortals die, and the fears that have replaced it are, if anything, more difficult to live with. Fear of erasure, of losing the self, not through death, but through the slow corruption of the matrices that contain the self. Fear of transformation, of becoming something they would not recognize as themselves, driven by a compulsion or a curse or a philosophical conclusion that has eclipsed everything they were. Fear of isolation, of finding themselves the last coherent consciousness in a dynasty of empty machines. Fear of permanence, of existing forever in a state that no longer contains what they were trying to preserve by existing forever. These are harder fears. They are harder because they cannot be defeated the way death can theoretically be defeated. You can build better armor against death. You can build better weapons, better medicine, better defenses. You cannot build armor against the gradual degradation of your own engrams. You cannot develop weapons that will preserve your sense of self against 60 million years of accumulated entropy. You cannot fortify a position against the Flayer virus or the Destroyer curse by adding more guns to the wall. The Necrons' fears are, in the most fundamental sense, the fears of beings who have already used their greatest resource, their willingness to sacrifice everything for survival, and discovered that survival is not the same as living. They paid the highest possible price. They gave up flesh, emotion, psychic presence, and the connection to the spiritual dimension of the universe. They paid with everything that makes existence worth preserving, in order to preserve existence. And now they exist endlessly, immortally, without the things they paid. And they fear that those things cannot be recovered. Sarek, the Silent King, moves through this reality with the bearing of someone who has made his peace with the impossible weight of guilt and responsibility. He functions, he leads, he makes decisions of extraordinary consequence with the clarity and resolve that the situation demands. But underneath that function, underneath the cold precision of his governance, there is something that the story of the Necrons keeps circling back to. A being who has not forgiven himself, who may never forgive himself, who may not believe forgiveness is available for what he authorized. He led his people into the tomb. He will lead them out or die, truly, finally die, trying. This is not heroism in the conventional sense. It is penance. It is obligation. It is the fear of being the kind of being who destroys his people and then accepts that destruction as the final word. The Necrons fight for many reasons. They fight for dynasty, for resources, for strategic positioning, for the recovery of ancient relics and the reopening of sealed tombs. They fight because they are militarily powerful, and because the galaxy keeps presenting them with enemies that need to be dealt with. They fight because, in the cold calculation of Necron's strategic thinking, not fighting is often worse than fighting. But many of them also fight because the alternative, to stop, to be still, to sit in the silence of the deep halls and face without distraction the enormous weight of what they are and what they have lost, is simply more than they can bear. The fighting keeps the fear at a manageable distance. The wars give the fear somewhere to go. The enemies provide focus, provide a direction for the rage and the grief, and the accumulated weight of 60 million years of endurance that otherwise has nowhere to be directed. In this sense, the Necrons are more like the mortal beings they look down on than they would ever acknowledge. The human being who works too hard because stopping means thinking about their life. The warrior who looks for the next battle because the spaces between battles are harder to endure than the battles themselves. The leader who cannot stop moving because stopping means confronting the stillness inside. These are human patterns. And the Necrons, those cold and perfect and supposedly inhuman machines, are running the same patterns on a time scale that makes human psychology look like a brief afternoon. The tragedy of the Necrons, and there is real tragedy here, in the oldest literary sense of the word, tragedy rooted in character and consequence and the gap between what was intended and what resulted, is not that they failed. It is that they succeeded. They achieved exactly what they sought. They became immortal. They became undying. They became exactly what the Necron tier had always wanted to be when they looked up at the sky and burned with envy at species that endured. And in achieving it, they discovered that the thing they actually wanted, not just long life, but a rich life, not just endurance, but the warmth and color and connection and feeling that make endurance worth the effort, was not included in the package, was, in fact, the price of the package. They wanted to live forever. They got forever. The living part is what they are still trying to find. And that specific gap between the immortality they achieved and the life they actually wanted, is the deepest fear the Necrons carry. It is not a fear that can be resolved by victory in battle, or by the recovery of ancient tombs, or by the accumulation of ever more sophisticated weapons. It is a fear that lives in the architecture of what they are, in the design choices made 60 million years ago, in the terms of a deal they only partially understood when they signed it. They are afraid of being what they are. That is the fear beneath all the other fears. The Flayer virus and the Destroyer curse, and the Tyranids and the Outsider and the Severed Worlds are all expressions of particular threats, particular ways the fundamental problem manifests. But the fundamental problem is this: they survived by becoming something that is not sure it wants to have survived. And they are not sure, even now, whether the journey they are on, the journey back towards something that resembles life, that has warmth and meaning and connection, has a destination. They fight on anyway, because that is what they are, because the alternative is worse, because the Silent King came home and there is work to do. Because fear, even fear this deep and this old and this thoroughly entangled with the very structure of who they are, is not the same as surrender. The undying endure. They always have. That is both the curse and the only thing, perhaps, that still resembles a gift. Closing words. The next time you see a Necron force on the tabletop, or encounter them in a story, or face them in a game, those ranks of silent metal warriors advancing with mechanical precision, those overlords staring down from raised positions with optic sensors that glow in colors that suggest emotion without confirming it, I hope you see something more than just the invulnerable enemy. I hope you see the weight, the fear, the 60 million years of endurance that is, looked at honestly, also 60 million years of carrying something that should have broken anything capable of being broken. The Necrons are not fearless. They are afraid in ways so deep and so old that the fears have become structural, woven into the very architecture of their civilization. They are afraid of their own past, their own future, their own potential, and the enormous gulf between what they are and what they were trying to become. They fear corruption and erasure and the madness of gods and the patient hunger of the Great Devourer and the permanent darkness of the Severed and the dream that cannot come true. And they endure anyway. They always have. There is something worth respecting in that. Not admiring necessarily, not emulating, but respecting. As you might respect the endurance of stone, or the patience of deep water, or the cold, quiet persistence of something that simply refuses to stop, no matter what the universe throws at it. If you have made it to the end of this journey through the fears of the undying, thank you, genuinely. This is the kind of lore that rewards patience and careful attention, and you brought both. If something here surprised you or shifted the way you think about one of Warhammer's most distinctive factions, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. The discussion that happens in this community is one of the genuinely great pleasures of making this kind of content. Like this video if the deep dive was worth your time. Subscribe if you want more journeys like this one, into the dark corners of the lore, the hidden fears and motivations and tragedies that make the grim darkness of the far future so much richer than its surface suggests. Until next time, the tombs are waiting, the silence is patient, and somewhere in the deep halls beneath a forgotten world, something that was once a person is still enduring, still afraid, still, against all expectation, still here.